Welcome, everybody, to Spirituality Adventures. Glad you're tuning into this episode. And hey, I want to mention real quickly before we get to the interview, if you'd like to hang out with me at Theology Beer Camp. Theology Beer Camp is in Springfield, Missouri, for those of you who are in the Midwest who are listening. Trip Fuller from Homebrewed Christianity is hosting this. There's, I think, 30 theologians, 30 podcasters, some musicians and stuff like that. And it's the craziest, most fun, nerdy theological experience I think that you could probably have. It's definitely theology that's not boring. And so, or as Tripp says, that doesn't suck. Theology that doesn't suck. All right. So anyway, you can go to my website, spiritualityadventures.com, and you can go on there and use, I think it's Spirituality Pod is the code that you can use to purchase a ticket, come hang out at the conference. You can get a discount with that code. So check it out there on the website. We'd love to see you there. I'll be hanging out. Love to have some friends join me. And so today it's kind of fun. I went to the Wild Goose Festival last year for the first time. That was 2022, July 2022. And Brian McLaren had encouraged me to go to it. Brian literally would have been the only person that I knew going into it, right? So I show up at this kind of Wild Goose, I don't know what you would call it, like kind of progressive Christian Woodstock camping North Carolina experience maybe, and show up there, and I jump on a little golf cart taking me from the parking lot to the main festival area. And all of a sudden somebody goes, "Hey, are you Fred Heron?" And I'm like, yeah. And it was Josh. And Josh used to attend Vineyard Church back like in 2000, somewhere like 8, 9, 10, somewhere in that area, right? 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, somewhere in that neighborhood. And he and his wife actually were married by one of my pastors at Vineyard Church. And so it was so cool because it was fun it helped me feel comfortable really fast, Josh, to bump into somebody that I knew and they kind of knew my world and I think probably could relate to some of the stuff that I had gone through as well in terms of just my whole big meltdown and then kind of reemerging into rethinking some of my theology and beliefs and all that kind of stuff. So thanks, Josh, for joining us. And this is Josh Burton. And I want to just jump in and have you share some of your background, where you grew up, maybe your family experience, your faith journey, kind of give us a brief introduction to yourself. Mm-hmm. And then we're going to dive into some therapy talk and religious trauma talk. How's that?
Sure.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Fred. It was both bizarre and just fantastic to run into you on the golf cart. It's still such of the thousands of people there, the fact that we both hit that same golf cart at the same, it was pretty awesome. Because I don't know that if we're in the crowd, I don't know if I'd have been able to pick you out. So it was great.
I wouldn't, there's no way. I mean, yeah. I certainly, when I clued in, I recognized you, remembered you and all that stuff, but I don't think I would have ever. Yeah. Right. I don't think I'd ever picked you out of a crowd. I don't think anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. I like to joke in terms of like my spiritual history. This is actually factually true, but my mom's water broke during a Baptist altar call. And I like to joke that's because Baptist altar calls are 9 months long. But I mean, if you're a Baptist, you're laughing. Like literally grew up where most of my childhood was in church. It was that was our primary like cultural social activity. We sort of progressed through more traditional American Baptist to becoming Southern Baptist, and this was before the Southern Baptists sort of had their big cultural split. So they still were primarily like a community Baptist. I mean, we like legitimately did things like we went and saw shut-ins and we brought food to people and we volunteered and like tried to show up for the needs in the community. And like that's when I think of my childhood experience, my I don't know, up until like middle school-ish, early high school, before like the sort of religious right takeover of the Baptist conversation. Like it was a lot of like, we're just going to show up and love people in our community and meet practical needs. And so I actually had a really positive experience in my early childhood with church as part of my life. We moved a lot growing up, and so I didn't get to participate in sports consistently or like never get to do scouts. I did some of those kinds of things. Anyways, at some point, my parents discovered the charismatic tradition. That's a story in and of itself, but it was like mid-high school, and then we swapped from being Southern Baptist to attending a really sort of growing charismatic church. And that opened up a lot of things, including learning about, again, this is a whole nother tangent, but learning about the Brownsville revival that was in Pensacola, Florida, that had just started a ministry school. And, you know, I did crazy things like turn down actual scholarships to actual schools. And I went to go do ministry work. And so I went to Bible college down at the revival that was going on in Florida.
So I forgot about that.
Yeah, it's a story.
I forgot that you went to Brownsville. Holy crud. Wow. We've come a ways, Josh.
We have. Yeah.
Interesting. For those of you who don't know, you know, and some of my audience isn't from the vineyard world, you know what I mean? But I've picked up new people and all that who only know me in the last few years. But I was in this vineyard movement for 29 years. And in the 90s, there was this thing called the Toronto Renewal. And one of the vineyards up in Toronto really had daily meetings, kind of renewal, revival type, charismatic, very charismatic Pentecostal stuff, you know, that went for 2-3 years. And I actually know the guys, you know, that were a part of that. And then kind of kicking out of that, then there was this Assembly of God version of the Toronto Renewal that kicked off in Brownsville, which is Florida, right?
Yeah, it's actually in Pensacola. It was like a historic African American community that was like the Brownsville neighborhood in Pensacola.
Yeah, and it then kind of had a similar thing where people from all over the world poured in, and very, very sort of Pentecostal, give your life to Jesus. And I think probably leaned a little bit more legalistic and bent than the Toronto Renewal, probably. It seemed to take on
absolutely
totally what I would call very legal. Like I even had vineyard friends who were going there, and they'd tell me the stuff that was being taught, and I was just like, I was cringing a little bit back then, even, you know, just because it seemed so legalistic and fundamentalist and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, had a lot of energy. People from all over the world showed up at their training school.
Yeah, it was an odd cultural experience, and like occasionally I'll run into people that went there, and you know, it's like I don't know, it's sort of like going to Woodstock. I'm sure people are like, there's just a handful of people that understand exactly what that experience was like, right? You know, yeah, we know.
Did that experience, while you were there, were you there for a year or two or something?
It's 2 years.
2 years. And did when you spilled out of that, you've seen it positively or negatively after you went through it? Just that time in your life, you know?
Yeah, at that time, I was on youth ministry staff there, and so I had a small group I was leading. I was one of the interns, and so I got to see sort of firsthand the anxieties that were coming up in these like middle school and high school kids I was working with. And so it was pretty early. I started to make a pretty hard line about just supporting them and having a message about the love of God, and just making that the way that I was going to lead. And funny enough, like we had requirements that we had to go to a youth leaders meeting on Sunday mornings, and it was ahead of the main church services on Sunday mornings. Somewhere in my first semester, I would go to that meeting, and because the services were so big, you could get lost in the crowd, but you couldn't get lost in that meeting because there was a smaller group. So I would go to that meeting, and then I'd hop in my little Honda Civic hatchback, and I would drive across Pensacola to this like burnout Exer church that was meeting in the warehouse district that was totally like open and affirming. And like I started doing that as my church on the side. So by the time I got out of there, I had really drawn some lines about where I was starting to put my energy. And luckily, I mean, there's things that I don't know, regret's a heavy word, but there's things that you could regret about that kind of experience. It definitely was an alter experience. I don't really regret how I showed up in the lives of the people that I was having responsibility for. Like I felt like even today, obviously I've got a couple decades since then, I would say different things, but I feel like I started to wrestle with what's the core of how I want to show up in the world there. And so, leaving the experience, it was, they had a big split with the denomination shortly after I left, and then it's a story in and of itself. But it was another one of those like denominational takeovers. We've got the money, and so the school wound up splitting off from the denomination at that point. So that probably at the time left more bad blood because you had students that you knew and teachers that you knew that were having to decide, do we align with the denomination or do we go and try to pioneer another Bible college that's not got a building, frankly, to meet in. So, yeah. And then out of that, I did, I hooked up with sort of an ex-Vineyard pastor, church planner, and we did inner city church planning in Kansas City in a huge refugee resettlement community. And I lived in that community. I had a house in that community, incredibly diverse, bought up an old Catholic campus and tried to do really presence-based, like we're just going to be neighbors, like, and we're when we have meals, we're eating together, and we tried to do meals every week, and we tried to just try to embed ourselves in the lives and be a part of the community, not just like come in the midst of. Now, legitimately, I was really poor at that point, so like I won't say anybody else there. we were sort of equal standing at that point economically, but like. We showed up, and it wasn't like we were coming in, to try to save the community. We really were trying to be a part of the community to the degree that we could. Still would do it differently now, but some of that stuff, I felt like for the little bit that we knew, we were trying to show up. And sort of at the end of that, my life, and this is a whole other story, sort of tragically fell apart of the stuff that I had been building. And it was, lots of debt and relationship loss and stepping out of ministry and going and getting a real job is what I was telling myself. I don't know that I actually feel that way. And then lo and behold, I show up at the Vineyard and hook up with a couple people there that were really working on inner healing and counseling, and that sort of became where I plugged in. And then you got to know me as well.
Right, and you met your wife in Kansas City, is that right?
Yeah, we were back in the day when internet dating was new, and you just assumed about everybody was going to abduct you. Like it was new. Like we met internet dating, believe it or not, and so gosh, we didn't date terribly long. It was only about 9 months or so before we got 11 months before we got married. And we got married at the Vineyard and then started our life together there. And now we're going on, 17 years married.
Yeah. Wild. So bring us up to speed where you're at now, like spiritually, and then we're going to dive into some therapy, religious trauma stuff.
Yeah. So, after Vineyard got involved in like increasingly progressive congregations, also got involved with sort of the mystical, meditative, using the Enneagram, using meditation practices. It was still progressive Christian, but like leaning on some Buddhist traditions. Did that for a while in here in Raleigh at a local congregation. Um, and then, sort of have been increasingly get involved in like podcast and virtual communities. For a while, we're not operating anymore, but for, I guess it was about 4 years, we operated a virtual religious trauma group for people coming out of the Bible college that I was a part of. There was a couple of us, four of us, that decided to found an online group, and we grew it to be a little over 100 people. And we started to just like baby step into what does it mean to create a safe space for people to talk about depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, questions about their faith. And actually, out of that, two of us decided to go and pursue formal education to be therapists. Believe it or not, that was sort of, for us, that was a life-changing experience, because we're like, we need more training. So did that for a while, and let's see. Now I don't know quite how to describe what I am today, if that makes sense. Eclectic is maybe values driven, and eclectic would probably be what I would say. Like I really have a strong sense of like what's important to me, and creating space for showing up for those values and for the people that I choose to show up for, but also inviting them to wrestle with what does it mean to show up for their values as well. And that for me includes things like hope and a faith, but I hold it loosely like this. I get benefit because I hope in these things, and I can see a personal benefit in it, and I can see a communal space that I can create by holding hope for that. But I don't feel like I have to hold it any tighter than that, because I'm not insecure about it. Like it's okay that it's just a beautiful hope. Like it's doing the job that it's meant to do in me, and it's bringing meaning that I need it to bring. And I want to create opportunities for other people to have that kind of like meaning making space where they don't have to defend a framework that then I'm going to come at them and try to poke apart. And that's probably more where I land today. So I try to see the beauty and the complexity of what it is to be human.
Mm-hmm. So give our audience just a sense of like the training that you're doing in therapy right now. Where are you doing that at, and what's
Sure.
your focus? And then we'll dive into some more.
Yeah. So, some people, when they have a midlife crisis, I've been working in like government program management, affordable housing, low income families for about 15, 20 years now. I decided I wanted some change, and some people go out and get a motorcycle, and I decided I was going to get an MSW degree and go into clinical social work to do mental health specifically. And so I started, I'm in my third year now with UNC here in North Carolina, University of North Carolina, working to get my master's in social work. And I'm currently in my final year of internship placement. For this kind of program, it requires 2 years of actual placement in the field. So it's very course heavy at the beginning, and it's very practical in the end. We do have a little bit of coursework now, but I'm putting in 2 full days a week, sometimes more, doing clinical mental health work here in Raleigh at a local private practice, and then I'm getting essentially credit. It's not college credits, but I'm getting credit towards the internship. And hopefully we'll be wrapped up in May. And then at that point, I'll get a different level of licensure and can start doing things like bill insurance directly. So that's what I'm working on.
Excellent. Okay. So, I went to rehab for 120 days back in November 2018 through February 2019. And, I remember like being in, courses that I took for pastoral care, and we took courses on counseling models, therapy models, anywhere from Rogerian to RET, rational emotive therapy, to all these, there's a psychoanalysis, when you do these, you get introduced to all these different therapy models. But when I was in rehab, I got introduced to DBT therapy, which I had some bad experiences actually in rehab, but that was one thing, out of all the bad things, that was one thing that I felt like was positive. And particularly, I loved the mindful meditation component of that. So, like growing up evangelical and then Vineyard, when we talked about meditation, it usually meant, rolling scripture over in your head, right? Like
Right.
meditating on scripture kind of thing. Maybe some worship music with
Yeah.
mixed in. But I had never really participated in any kind of mindfulness meditation or any of the influence of, say, Buddhism and meditation kind of world. And so I really got attracted just because I have I have anxiety disorder. That was my racing brain. That's what gave me insomnia, and I didn't sleep very well for 30 years. And that's what really got me into trouble when I started trying to work on that. So I pressed into the DBT stuff when I got back to when I came to Kansas City. I looked around, and there's a lady named Amy Tibbetts that started Lilac Center in Kansas City decades ago. She studied with Marsha Linehan,
Mhm.
and I started actually going to her, seeing her, had her on my podcast. We talked about DBT. And for those of you who have been longtime listeners, if you missed that episode, you could go back like 2.5 years and find Amy Tibbetts and us talking about that. But I found DBT super helpful for me. And as I was trying to rebuild my life, I also found internal family systems really helpful. I found that model really helpful. And then I noticed that I have not really myself done any worked with the ACT model, acceptance commitment therapy. So I'm kind of curious from your perspective, like if you think about those three models, and I know there's so many more, but if you think about those three, how do they overlap? How are they different? And give me your take on that, and kind of where you found where you want to dig in, and where you found value for what you're going to be doing with your, or what you're currently doing, what you're going to be doing in the future.
Yep. Yeah, it's a great question. So, and I'll just preface this with I'm a learning novice, but so if I'll hold to the pieces that I know. I'm sure there are experts that know each of those better, but those are all in the family of cognitive behavioral therapies. That's the way that is becoming more and more common to talk about them. And so there is what they call the third wave of therapy models, which is more of what we're seeing currently. Acceptance and Commitment Therapy Act is one of them. DBT is one of them. IFS is one of them. There's a number of them that are now sort of third wave, which is based on what they have learned over the years of the CBT school. And so there are different variations of it, but practitioners would basically say it's all in the family. It's all part of these CBT schools.
Behavioral therapy, for those of you who aren't familiar with these little
these little acronyms. Yeah. And so DBT, like sometimes when you're trying to assess where you're going to get traction or what the presenting problem is with a client, sometimes you're looking at things that are behavioral primarily. And so like if you think CBT, there's some that are the big B they'll talk about. And DBT is a big B therapy. It's a big behavioral therapy. And so it's going to deal much more at prescribing things to notice and intervene around behaviors that then become sort of reinforcers of more behaviors, sometimes that lead to thoughts, but may be triggered by thoughts, and then you get stuck in these behavioral patterns, right? And so it has more versions of like worksheets and processes. Like a true DBT experience is actually like you're working with a team in a small group, similar to like AA. Typically, like there are therapists that use DBT skills, and they use DBT to help provide therapy. But a true like Marsha Linehan model, you're actually going to be in a small group with DBT coaches doing your work. And so there is like that AA piece of like group support around behaviors.
Yep.
And so that's I think DBT is really, really great because it deals with like embodiment, and it deals with things that are showing up for us in our head that are causing behavioral reactions or triggering behavioral reactions that we don't really know. So that's the space that I think it occupies really, really well. It's like if I was to talk about like sort of the conscious mind, the unconscious mind, and the body, like it to me fits first really in that like that bodily experience kind of piece where you're learning what you're responding to in your behaviors, right? And like it helps you manage those first, which may eventually let you get traction to work on thoughts, right? Or to work on sort of unconscious motivators. And so like for a lot of people, it's you got to get those behaviors in a place where you're not like blowing up your life anymore actively, so that you can maybe get traction in some of these other areas. IFS, or internal family systems, takes a lens of sort of understanding people as their parts. You know, you probably have had somebody that you talk to and they go, well, part of me feels this way and part of me feels that way. Or sometimes in a situation and part of me really wants to show up and go to this party. And there's a part of me that also wants to stay home and, you know, wants to just eat ice cream and cry to myself, right? So what it does is it really takes and personifies those parts. There's particular roles that it recognizes in IFS for like managers and firefighters and exiles. There are sort of three primary roles, but where people start to then put their own identifiers around parts of their experience that have really adapted and almost become fixated roles in this tangled fight that they do in their internal family. That's where the internal family systems comes from. And IFS to me probably reminds me the most of like some of the inner healing stuff that I was a part of, where you might use things like imagination to try to engage yourself at a more vulnerable moment where there was a trauma occurring or a place that you continue to get stuck. Mm-hmm. And then you are able to step into that place and imagine saying to yourself the thing that you needed to say to not react in pain or to not react in a way that then embeds sort of a traumatic response. And so IFS is a lot of negotiating like those roles within yourself. But to me, it lives in those like almost unconscious drivers. Like people that really, really benefit from it are those that like, okay, I figured out how to manage my behavior and I figured out how to manage my thoughts, but I keep winding up in these situations and I can't explain why I keep acting this way. Like, and it to me does that piece of it better than the other two do. And that sort of brings me to acceptance and commitment there, because it to me is in the CBT school, it's a strong cognitive process. And so like acceptance and commitment therapy, really, you have to have the ability to notice yourself. So to back up when you're talking about mindfulness meditation, the way that I train about mindfulness is most of the time, and this is tied to acceptance and commitment therapy, people have triggers, they have patterns of behaviors, they have things that show up in their life, and we have autonomic processes that we just run in. We've written the script, it kept us safe at a previous point in our life, we're doing the thing that our brain or our body says, this is going to bring me protection, this is going to bring me significance, love, it's going to bring me attention, whatever it is. Whether or not it actually does that anymore, we've become so habituated to reacting and responding that way that it's just going, right? Mindfulness for me is helping clients, and what we call that being fused. Like there's an identity of yourself, there's a pattern of behaviors, there are things that are occurring in your life, and you are fused to that conceptualized identity, you are fused to those behaviors, the trigger happens, and we're just moving around, we're moving down the stream, we're doing the same thing we've done 1,000 times. You see this like in relationships really commonly, where I'll sit with somebody and they're like, yeah, we've had the same fight for 8 years. And I'm like, yeah. So let's talk about the patterning here and what's showing up. And are we willing to start looking at how we've gotten fused in this pattern? And you're just basically reinforcing it again and again and again with lots of repeated conflicts. Mindfulness, which is also at the core of DBT, but I think it's getting into some of that noticing your behaviors. Mindfulness with the ACT school is about making just the slightest bit of space between the trigger and our response. And can I notice that there is something happening in my life that is a prompt? It is a situation. It is an experience. It is a person. And I have the ability to notice that my brain is generating thoughts. It's generating feelings, it's generating urges, and it wants to respond to that scripting. But can I notice it and create just enough space to go, okay, Now there's me and there's the observer of me here.
Hmm.
And if there's the observer of me here, I could maybe choose to do something different in that situation. Like I don't just have to say, well, you made me feel this way. I
Hmm.
can go, my brain is telling me that this is going on, or my feelings are showing up, and this is the feeling that is showing up. And I notice that, and I can still choose to do something different. So, and that there's a lot more. It's a hexaflex model. It's basically 6 points of flexibility that you're trying to embed with acceptance and commitment therapy as a model. But when you think of like some of the work of ACT, that's right at the core is just maximizing that space for the observer. And really the next thing that I do with clients is I try to pivot them into what does a life that matters to you actually look like? And we do values driven interviewing where I actually go through and I'll interview them on their life story. And we start to build a list of, these are the things that I would build over in my life if it got destroyed, or if I was 70, I would say my life was incomplete if I didn't have it in my life. And we start to look at the stories that we're telling ourselves in there and see what sticks, what are the things that they actually want to hold to. And then what we try to do is when we work on getting that break between the fused mind and the ability to make a choice, is we go, okay, you're showing up with the power that you have today, with who you are today, and you want to make a choice that puts you 1% towards your values, 1% towards a life that you would say matter. What would that be today? And if you can get people into just the slightest bit, 1%, 2% of a change where they can start to make a different choice in those situations, you can actually walk them out of like some anxiety looping, some depression looping, like things that are just getting reinforced again and again because they're starting to live a life that they think matters to them. And so like all the feedback that's coming from their internal systems, their amygdala, all their endocrine systems, that's telling them like I might die, or I am dying and it's depression, right? Like all these things that are sending signals to our body, like they start to break down because they're able to tell themselves a different story about the life that they're actually living. So
I was thinking a couple of things popped in my head as you're explaining that. So Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, has this famous quote: between stimulus and response, there is a space. That space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and freedom. And so that immediate, our reptilian amygdala brain, fight, flight, freeze. I'm trusting the science behind mindful meditation because I've been pressing into this for a couple of years now, and I'm doing a training with a 2-year teacher training with Tara Brock and Jack Cornfield. I'm in about 6 months in now. But the idea is that through mindful meditation, we can expand that space, right? It can become a little larger. Am I hearing you right? Is that kind of what you're describing?
Yeah.
The other thing I was thinking about, which is extremely valuable, right? When you create space between your amygdala and your prefrontal cortex and can give your prefrontal cortex a little bit more room to breathe and make good decisions and regulate your emotions, that's pretty healthy, I think, versus just reaction all the time. The other thing I was thinking about, when we talk about Christian inner healing, it's interesting to me because, I really dove into that pretty heavily. And then, as you know, we tried to create, a church model for that. And if you study the roots of that, it really was some early Christian leaders, mostly that I know, like Catholics and Episcopalians and stuff, who were into psychoanalysis, right? But then they tried to kind of take some of the psychoanalysis therapy, kind of move it into a bit more of a Christian framework. Would that be accurate to you, do you think? That's how I always thought about it. It may not be.
I think that's in the mix for sure. And I also think there's like, you got a lot of history in Christian mystics and like the Eastern Orthodox Church.
Yeah.
Like we know the church that we know because it was the one that got the money and the power, like the one that became systemized and became, resourced. But there's been a lot of tradition in the Christian church for centuries that embraced this like embodied meditative practices, but you don't lead tens of thousands because you're showing up as a desert monk, right? Like
Mhm.
that's not the way it works. So I think there is some of that where, like, if you look at any of the early Christian mystics, I think they had a very like imagination friendly and embodied experience. Like that was core to their spiritual story. And so to me, it doesn't seem like you're having to pull from some other tradition. Not that I think there's any reason to judge that, but I think it's there in the tradition. It just isn't.
So, I mean, you like going back into some of the Middle Age mystics, even, you think
100%.
all the way. Yeah. Okay, cool. Interesting. Yeah. I didn't ever think of it that way. I think I was so much into modern, therapy models that
Yeah.
yeah. And that honestly, in the gap my education, all the theology that I've done, probably the thing that I had the least amount of immersion into was the mystics, the
Mm.
Christian mystics through the tradition, which I kind of like now. I kind of like, dang, I need to go back and dig into some of that. But uh, I need a couple of lifetimes just to learn all that I want to learn, Josh.
Yeah. I hear you.
So okay, so let's talk about how this then religious trauma. Let's how do people like, this is too big of a question, but as you are working with people, what do you see some of the most common elements of religious trauma? How would you define that? What are some of the ways? What are some of the things that help or that create religious trauma? And then how do these therapy models help
Yeah.
us?
So a heavy therapy term is called a functional analysis. And so as a therapist, one of the things that we try to do is we try to look at what does that belief or that behavior actually do for the person. And I think too often when it comes to things like religious systems, we try to approach it purely from a cognitive lens of like, well, you're using this set of proofs and this set of documentation and these cultures to reference, and that's why you believe it this way. And somebody else goes, well, this is why I believe that way, right? And it's all in the cognitive space, and that's how we try to approach a lot of those things. Functionally, I think if you actually look at what religious beliefs actually do for people, it has a lot of actual very deep psychological purposes. It manages, I mean, we're in a world right now, obviously you and I are talking on different sides of the country using the internet right now, right? And we literally could get off of this and look at information about anything in the world. We could be inundated with an anxiety trigger about something going on in a part of the world we will never go to, right? That could happen 2 minutes after you and I finish today. That is an ever-present reality that we all are living in today. And so when we start to understand that the world is increasingly complex, and we're also in a world that seems to be more pressured towards pushing people towards snap judgments of virtue signaling or of aligning with one party or another party, which ultimately I would say if you do a functional analysis, those are primarily about managing anxiety, showing some tribalism. These are my people, these are my community. Religious belief systems, I think, fulfill a huge role right now in managing a lot of anxieties. I think it's always had that role, but when you think of a world, especially the last 20, 25 years, that has gotten so complex and so big, and there is a level of good, bad, evil, injustice, power plays, cultural change that we're experiencing, all in there. Like if you were to sit down and interview somebody about what they believe, you might start with what they believe about their holy books and their scripture and their doctrines, but pretty quickly it's going to get into other cultural issues. It's going to get into economics. It's going to get into political parties. It's going to get into lots of other things that are the beliefs of the system. Functionally, when we look at that, I think a lot of these belief systems have become a version of a tribalized identity for people, and it's what their community has formed around. Maybe that's their parents, maybe that's their grandparents, maybe it's not. I mean, it may be tied to their birth family, it may not be, but it's become a really powerful system for managing meaning making, for telling somebody what's good, what's bad, for managing sources of anxiety. If you can quickly sort, somebody comes to you and, okay, we've got, starving immigrants at the border, right? Well, that's a very complex issue, right? That is a difficult thing to decide what level of responsibility should somebody have for that, what systems should be in play, how do we address that adequately, what are the level needs, where should they go? Like, these are very, very complex situations. People that want to reduce it to like, this is the one answer, like they really are complex situations. If you've got a belief system that goes, here's my answer for what we do with immigrants, always welcome the immigrant. Or, I also have a version of patriotism that says that no, they're a threat, and we see both of those actually in two different kinds of churches going on right now. We've got some that have become, havens and protectors of immigrants, and some that have gone the other way, right? And both of those, I would say that that's an issue that goes beyond our faith system, but it's gotten embedded in these like subsets of belief systems that become tribalized identities. Humans, ultimately, we really want to belong to something, and we want to belong to something that's bigger than ourselves. We want to belong. I mean, we are the social primate, at our core. And so, like, we are constantly looking for what does it take to belong. And I think if you really look at the function of belief systems, and religious belief systems, I think are just one of the most powerful ones. I mean, they manage what we don't know about what happens when we die. I mean, if you want to talk about like something going well beyond the reach of even the world that we're going to live in, we're going to say, hey, we've created a system that even explains what happens then, right? That's powerful. I mean, it's deeply, deeply powerful. And so when you talk about people experiencing religious trauma, like, you're talking about a context where they are a part of something that exceeds even their lifetime, and it has defined their community, and it has defined maybe their political position. It has defined their view on economics. It has opened up friends to them. It's opened up other maybe business opportunities to them. It has been, for a lot of people, it hasn't been a cognitive thing. This has been a world-defining framework that gave them access to their human experience. And in that, you have humans being humans. You have humans that abuse power. You have humans that make mistakes. You have humans that compete with one another and take advantage of opportunities, right? Like, humans are humans, right? But it shows up in this space where there's so many unmarked connections. It's like a spider web in somebody's soul, right? Like, it's got so many places that it's tied up that we don't fully understand it. And then something happens. Usually you see a shift, a lot of people, it's like they've got a family member or a neighbor that they love deeply, and they come out to them, right? That's been a big one in recent years. And they're like, wait, my compassion can't be real in the context of my actual community if I don't embrace this person and figure out how to love them, right? And then they find out, oh, the belief system, that doesn't fit in the belief system. And then everything gets thrown up on its hinge, right? Like, you have people that, okay, you can't be part of our club anymore. You can't be part of our church. What that does for people is it takes so much away, and it leaves them reeling for something that can explain the complexity of life, that gives them a community, that helps them know what good and bad is. I mean, it's deeply powerful, right? And I think it's wrong to say, like, for some people, they don't have the experience that, like, hey, a church leader abused me. I certainly know people do. I've had conversations with people that was their experience, and it's real easy for those people to go like, yes, that qualifies as some version of religious trauma because it's got a face behind it, right? I think the majority of people that I talk about, it's like they got shunned by people that were their close friends, or they can't go to Thanksgiving with their family anymore because they believe something differently, or they simply were free falling for a year or two and experienced severe anxiety and depression because everything in their brain was telling them that they might die because they lost their social network. They lost their explanation for a good role. They lost everything got thrown up. And now they're like, I don't know how to build this on my own from scratch, right? And that in and of itself should be traumatic for most people, right? And so I think that, religious trauma gets applied pretty broadly. you also have, you and I talked a little bit earlier too about religious systems that become pressuring in and of themselves or performative in and of themselves, right? And that again, those to me feel a little bit more obvious. But like, yes, if you're being left in an abusive relationship, if you aren't allowed to think for yourself because you have to run everything by church leadership. Like I have met people, but those to me seem so much more obvious because they're clear abuses of power. They're taking away the ability for, partners and families to make decisions that they need to make together, those kinds of things. But I think that also gets grouped in. There is, and I'm spacing on the name, there is actually several studies on religious strain that one of the universities, I want to say it's Northern Midwest, has done. That is interesting if somebody's looking to research in that area, where they're looking at like the impact of sort of these toxic ideas, and the toxic ideas about God, the toxic ideas about what happens if I leave the church, do I go to hell, those kinds of things. And the long and short of it is there is some clear correlation that some people in the more extreme, and you look at the bell curve, the more extreme toxic ideology about God and about what happens to them, a big angry God, those kinds of things, that they have more of like a PTSD response in terms of the embodied response that they experience. It correlates more like that. And so there's actually been some decent psychological research in the ideas space of like, what does a really harsh idea of God do versus what does the idea of a God that welcomes you or a community that welcomes you do. And they've seen that in the long-term mental health of the data set that they were able to. They have actually done 5 or 6 studies, so it's not just one, but worth looking into if somebody's got interest in that area.
Play it again.
Religious strain. If you go to Google Scholar and type in religious strain, I could pull it up while we're talking, but it's pretty easy to find. There's like several studies out there.
Interesting. Yeah. So, pastoring people for 40 years, people, experience life. They flow in and out of religious communities. They believe, they don't believe, or they believe 5 things, out of the 10 things that this religious community do, they like 5 or 6 of them, and their kids really like it, but they're not sure about the other 3 or 4, whatever. Mm-hmm. Some religious trauma, I guess, could be a cognitive thing where you just, the stuff that you were taught growing up and the simplicity of that doesn't work for you anymore. Cognitive dissonance creates like, oh, this isn't really what I believe anymore. And if you're really heavily rooted in that sociologically, then leaving a community can be extremely stressful, create lots of dissonance, and could, like you mentioned, it can cause problems with family or friends, or you lose family, you lose friends, you lose your community. I mean, I've just gone through that, right? These last 4 or 5 years. And it was so much trauma. I literally questioned everything I'd ever believed. And I felt so depressed that I had failed my own religious system of beliefs. Like I had let myself down. I didn't live up to some of my core values and my professed beliefs and the things that I had taught for years. And it just fell apart for me. And it just literally went dark, and I had to question everything. And I felt super depressed and close to suicide, probably. I'm not alone in that. And the reasons that I went through that aren't the same as other people who have gone through that kind of deep religious trauma. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it is an abusive power figure, right? Who either sexually or however abused. But sometimes it is this cognitive dissonance with the community that we've grown up with, and then it doesn't work for us anymore. So many angles to religious trauma. And I actually do think it's like PTSD. Like, as I've studied, how the amygdala stores trauma in order to protect you in the future. It's a survival instinct, right? Mm-hmm. And when you go through that trauma, anything that triggers it you're all of a sudden you're moving away from it. So
Yep.
what have you, for people who have gone through that and they're, what do you find? Because the thing, and I work with people like this too.
Mhm.
People still seem to hunger for community, but they're afraid of it, right? Because the community that they were a part of kind of didn't work for them. But then they still have this hunger for community. I think even if their belief systems didn't work for them, you still grasp for some beliefs to hang on to, right? You need some
Mhm.
guideposts. So in your work, when you talk about this, what have you found to be like, if you could put it in what are two or three key things that you find that help the healing process of religious trauma? And then how do people find new values and new community? Like that's a hard thing to do, especially if you've been immersed in one particular
Mhm.
tribe for most of your life. Like I wouldn't even call myself a midlife crisis. I'd call myself a 3/4 life crisis.
Right.
And then my prayer life, I was like, God, like, couldn't you like let me fall apart at 40 instead of almost 60? Like I would have had more time to rebuild. I fell apart at pretty late in life. And then, oh my God, I feel like a teenager again, trying to kind of rebuild all these things. It's very awkward, very interesting. But yeah, give us some of the best points of healing for religious trauma that you've found, and how do people find new beliefs, new community that support the journey of healing from religious trauma? Now that's way big. So
Yeah, it's complicated, right? Because for some people coming out of, coming out of like physical abuse, or they were being gaslit and, by a narcissist, right? That was like, I would say you probably need to go work with a therapist, because those probably are struggling with like true PTSD responses, right? Because that was an assault on their personhood, right? And they may not have they may eventually have the religious ideas and the systems that they need to work on, but like they need to work on what does it mean to show up in their own body, right? And that's where I feel like for people that are coming from that position, I I think working on stability in your own body is key. And so that, there's a variety of modalities that work on PTSD and trauma work that's out there, and skilled therapists should be able to work with somebody. There's even some things like EDMR, the body keeps the score kinds of stuff that's looking at like the brain connection with traumatic response in the body, entanglement there. People I think largely the results show that it's generally positive, but there's a number of different modalities out there. There's cognitive processing therapy, that's another trauma-based one. DBT is another one that a lot of times, if it's behavioral outputs that they're trying to manage, that they'll use for trauma. But cognitive processing therapy is another major one. I would say if you're in that camp, you need to try to show up for yourself, which may be difficult for people if they're carrying a lot of shame. But to show up for themselves and find an affirmative, equipped, skilled therapist to work on. You need to learn how to show up in your own body again.
yeah, get into therapy, folks. Good therapy models.
100%.
Like the ones we're talking about are pretty good, right?
Yeah, yeah, and they're like, you can ask for a therapist that's an evidence-based therapist. I will say, just as a catch-all, some of us grew up where we were like, hey, my pastor is my counselor, or it's Christian counseling. And so I've had people that the moment that you start talking about this work, they're immediately triggered, because they're going, I don't want that. Like, and so I'm not saying that. You can look for an evidence-based practice, and those are practices that have been researched to be and demonstrated to be usually beneficial for the majority of the participants. And a skilled therapist is going to see what's working in your situation. They're going to be able to adapt to, and frankly, if they're a therapist that doesn't have a specialty, they are required, they should refer you to somebody that has that specialty, so that if something's not getting traction with you, they're going to try to find you the help that you need. And so I say that like there are people that are devoted to making this a science validated practice. Now, it doesn't mean it's a guarantee for everybody, and it doesn't mean it's not a little bit trial and error trying to find a therapist that you connect with. Like that's just humans being humans. But there are a lot of therapists out there that are really trying to do their best to provide consistent care to individuals, but that are following the modalities and the evidence-based
Yeah.
practices that are there.
Yeah. And during COVID, we had these bunches of online therapy, like that have advertised even nationally to some degree, that where you can connect with a therapist online. And have you found any of those? Like, is there one or two of those that you actually like, or do you think, or would you recommend people search around in their local setting where you can go face to face versus Zoom, or just does it matter?
I've got a love-hate with virtual. So I'm about 50-50 virtual and in person. And the 50% that's virtual, they're still all in my area. Like we could physically get together, but for a lot of them, it'd be a 45-minute to an hour drive, or it happens that the only hour they have free in their week is over lunch on a Friday. And so we do sessions over lunch on Fridays. So that's when we can meet. So that for me, my preference is to use those for situations, or like say you've got a client that's dealing with such high level anxiety, they can't get out of their home. Okay, virtual makes a ton of sense for that. I do find that in-person helps for speed of recovery. Like I've gotten better and better at using technology for therapy and doing work together. We'll set up whiteboards or do worksheets, or I'll interview and take notes. So I've gotten better at doing that, but I feel like you can do those things in person with, fewer barriers. And then I think it's easier to build that therapeutic bond in person. In terms of the online ones, so much of it would depend on the actual therapist that you're working with. Pros and cons there. You might find somebody that's great, that's available. You don't have to do a lot of searching in like Psychology Today, or Googling in your area to see who's a therapist in your area, talking to a friend to get a referral, because they're going to have a whole bunch and they're going to plug you in with somebody. Some of the things that makes me a little bit skeptical is like the statements they make that like, if you don't feel like you're connecting at any point, we can swap and put you with another therapist. What I'll tell you is that for a therapist to really get into a position to understand your presenting issue and your history well, like it's going to take them a couple sessions. And honestly, half of the time when clients come to you, the thing they tell you in the first couple sessions is their presenting problem winds up not being their presenting problem. But it's the thing either they were comfortable with, or is the thing they refused with when they walked in the door. And so it's the thing that you might start with, but some of those things take the history with the client. And so if you're able to get that in that kind of online, BetterHelp being one of the more well-known ones, then fantastic. And if somebody's able to get a therapist that's working well with them, fantastic. I worry a little bit about people that might have concerns around vulnerability, or have concerns around how they're presenting, that they just go, okay, I'm feeling discomfort now, and now I'm going to hop to another therapist, right? And I think it could, I'm not saying people have to go to a therapist when they don't want to, but it could become sort of a reinforcer of some of the exact same things you're trying to work somebody out of in therapy, if they can just like, okay, I'm going to swap. This got awkward. I'm going to swap. I shared too much. I'm going to swap. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I don't know factually. I've never heard. I don't know that they even release the numbers. How often that happens in that space? That's the tickle in my brain. Is like, do you develop longer relationships that are long enough? 4 months, 6 months to really do some quality work with somebody before they move on.
Yeah. So just we're about out of time here, but I wanted to. It's interesting to me, like, there's lots of types of trauma. I would recommend anybody get therapy for any kind of trauma they've gone through. So not all trauma is religious in nature. It does seem to me, Josh, and I'm just curious, you can make a quick comment on this. And then if people want to connect with you, I want you to give them how they might do that. But it seems to me like the people, how some people grow up in church and you know,
Hmm.
they hang, they don't really buy into it deeply. They kind of
Hmm.
skirt along and, okay, yeah, that's cool. But they're not really ever really into it. They don't ever really go deep. They're not ever really pursuing, trying to build the belief system of the religious community that they grew up in. And
Hmm.
they kind of can take it or leave it a little bit. Maybe they grow up, get out of college, have some kids, and they think, oh, yeah, we should take our kids to church. And they go back to church. I found that some of those people sometimes have, um, it's almost like they never really bought deeply into the religious culture anyway.
Right.
So their trauma usually manifests in different ways if they have
Hmm.
trauma, right?
Hmm.
But those who invest deeply in their religious cultures and then it falls apart, that's the trauma. And that's kind of one of the things I've noticed these last 4 years as I've worked with people.
Hmm.
The people who believed harder
Right.
have have the harder time. Like I believed deeply, and then
Yeah.
at a late in life to to kind of all of a sudden question everything. And I was always a deep thinker, deep reader, but man, it's painful sometimes, to go
Yeah.
through that. It can be a painful thing, religious trauma. And I see that the harder people believe, the harder they fall. I mean, to make it really simple, you know what I'm saying?
It's 100%. Yeah. To me, it's the closer it gets to like your conceptualized identity for yourself. Like if it's literally like, hey, they have a movie night for my kids, right? Great, we're gonna have fun. I don't have to plan a night for my kids. It just happened to be a church, right? Like, and you're like, okay, we don't have that anymore. Great, we're gonna get some other activities, right? And to your point, like I think there's people that they use church activities like that. They like the music around the holidays, maybe, like,
Hmm.
and fine, that's not to judge them. I'm just saying
Right.
to your point, like there are those that
Sometimes they're
it
healthier.
becomes I, yeah, yeah.
Just
I
kidding.
would say that
At
that's
least when it
probably
comes to
true.
religious stuff, anyway.
Yeah,
Oh gosh.
yeah, yeah. But I think it's those that grew up and it became just sort of a core part of, if you're going to do a blurb about yourself, it would be one of the descriptors. You get 8 words to describe yourself. If one of them is that, or it's the first one, like then I'd be like, yeah, you probably are going to experience some pain when something goes wrong in life that the system doesn't explain, right? Like this is going to jerk you around quite a bit because it's like right there.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I have a friend who does a podcast here in Kansas City that I think he would call himself an ex-evangelical, and he grew up in this really strict Pentecostal thing. Like they taught him that the devil put dinosaur bones into the ground to deceive people.
I have heard that one.
Literally what he was taught. I'm like, I grew up pretty conservative, but I'd never even heard that one. I'm like, okay, interesting. Yeah, that didn't take long to fall apart on him,
Yeah.
but he believed it for a while, he literally thought that.
Well, I think part of it is like depending on the age when some of those things, I mean, I'm sure you've had these experiences. Like it starts with like I got your nose, like when your uncle or your granddad get your nose, and you're like, when you're really young, you're like, I think you just got my nose, right? Like there's a point in life when somebody tells you something like that, and you don't have the skills or the ability or the perspective or history to go like, this might not be true. And I think that's exactly it. Like you're like, oh,
Yeah,
yep.
yeah. Well, man, we could talk all day about this. Thank you for joining us at Spirituality Adventures. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Those of you who listened all the way to the end, thanks so much. If you're not already supporting Spirituality Adventures, go to the website, spiritualityadventures.com, and jump on and be a part of our support team. We'd greatly appreciate it. Josh, how can people get a hold of you if they want to?
I'll share my email with you if that's okay, and then do you have show notes that you can put it in?
We can put it in notes. Yeah.
Sure, that'd be great. That's what I'll do.
All right. Share it. You want me to just put it in the notes?
Yeah, no, it's fine. I was going to send you the notes if that's
Okay.
okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Perfect. All right. Well, Josh, tell Sarah I said hey. Sarah, right?
I will. Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell her I said hello, your wife, and man, thanks for the work you're doing. I love it. I'm glad that our paths crossed again, and
Yeah.
I love hearing where you're going with all this. So
It's good to see you, Fred. It's good to reconnect. Hopefully see you next year. Are you going to make it back to the?
I'm planning on making it a regular event for sure. Yep. Getting to know lots of the people around the Wild Goose Festival. And so I'm planning on being there. All right.
Great. We'll see you then.
Thanks everybody for tuning in to Spirituality Adventures. Thanks, Josh. Take care, and we'll see you next time.
This has been another episode of Spirituality Adventures. Be sure to visit the website at spiritualityadventures.com and click on the support tab and help us keep creating content like this.